COVID talks. Okay, well, welcome back for our first COVID talk of the COVID Convocation Series talk of the spring semester. We have at least 3 planned for the spring semester, and we're still working on developing a couple more, so we hope we'll have others as well. You will want to tune in, 2 weeks from today for a talk by Dr. Tahira Walker, our Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, who'll be talking about the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color and minority populations in the United States, and what some of that means, and how that may affect the progress of the pandemic, both up to this point and going forward. And then later, one of our graduates, actually 2 of our graduates, Robert Brosh, the National Institutes of Health, who is on the call today, as well as Becca Lee, who graduated in 2020 and now is working as an intern in his lab, will be presenting on their work on kind of molecular level interactions or opportunities to interrupt the action of the COVID virus, and we'll be talking about that as well, and that is on March 9th. So those are really exciting things to look forward to. But today we're going to hear from Dr. Chelsey Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher joined Bethany College's faculty just this year. She's one of our new people in physical education. She attended her undergraduate at Muskingum College, another small private liberal arts college, so she knows how these things work. And her graduate degrees at WVU, her PhD from Robert Morris. She had worked regularly in a variety of different fields, both in teaching and athletics management for school districts in Eastern Ohio, before coming to join Bethany this fall. And she's going to be talking about the ways that COVID has hastened the arrival of the future when it comes to NCAA sports. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Fletcher, and hopefully we'll have some opportunities to ask some questions at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. I appreciate that. I also want to thank, I got several, so this is recorded, I got a lot of feedback from fellow faculty, wishing me well today. It's been a beautiful, overwhelming experience being a part of the Bethany family. So the support is pretty incredible. As Dr. Lane explained, I'm going to be talking about, so I'm going to share my screen here. Dr. Lane had talked about how we would be looking at the effects of COVID on NC2A sports. And I, by no means, do not think in any regard that I am an aficionado at this topic whatsoever. I kind of wanted to approach this more from, I think it's going to present us in sports studies preparation programs a great deal of opportunity for our students, for all of the issues that are coming forward and are going to continue to unfold. So I wanted to just take the time today to highlight some things that the NC2A has done since the onset of COVID, and how they have taken care of, attempting to take care of the health and safety of student athletes and some of the major impacts that have occurred. And ending the presentation today, hopefully with some great ideas for prospective students for sports studies, for senior projects, and leave it with time for questions. But again, I by no means am claiming that I can predict the future, know exactly what all of the athletic administrators in current NC2A institutions are going through, because I do not miss my time in athletic administration right now during this COVID pandemic. I do not envy them at all. So I'm as much of I'm enjoying my time teaching at the college level, I am super grateful I'm not having to handle the chaos that they're going through. So one of the first things that I wanted to do was, what we look at in my classes. We define sport, and the NC2A has done a great job in terms of, defining sport. And if you go out onto their website, these quotes here are what they were using with the inclusion of women's sports. And so it's an institutional activity, and it's whether it's varsity level or club level, and it involves, the physical exertion, which is going to be a topic and of concern with the COVID and how we are trying to maintain the safety of athletes. So looking at the physical exertion for the purpose of competition. And that concept of purpose of competition brings a lot of topics that we'll look at, here shortly, that deal with, an economic impact and these rivalries that have occurred, and all of the money that's brought in and we're losing right now because of the hastening of sports. And it involves teams or individuals, and it's an intercollegiate competition and structure. So when I'm in my classes, we talk a lot about interscholastic, K-12 versus intercollegiate. And they're operating under these standardized rules. And this topic of standardized rules is a big issue with NC2A and the governance of who is in charge of mandating COVID regulations. So we're going to delve into that very shortly. So these standardized rules, who makes the standardized rules, who is the governing body, who's in charge of ratifying all of those rules, because those rules have been quickly changing, and they're constantly changing with regard to competition and postseason play and future scheduling and how we handle facilities. I mean, it's truly an awesome undertaking. And that standardization of rules, how it's broken down, we've got this big umbrella of NCAA, right? And then we have these divisions, and then we have these conferences, and then we have institutions underneath that. And who's in charge? But what we have yet to mention is federal, state, and local guidelines, which is kind of overseeing everything, right? So before we look at who's governing and who's making those decisions, we've defined sport. And I think Coach Forsty, who's on the call, and I'm going to refer to her quite a few times today. Hopefully she'll pipe in for a little bit, or pipe in, I'm sorry. We have experienced in our history with sport. We know that in the US culture, sport is huge, right? It is just a powerful, powerful movement. And if we didn't realize how powerful it was before, because of just, it's just become second nature, wow, did we ever see it as everything just came to a screeching halt with COVID? Our athletes couldn't play. And then it's like when the electricity goes off and you keep trying to turn that light on and it's still not going on because the electricity's off. We keep flipping on the television thinking we're going to watch some type of competition, but it wasn't just stopped at the K-12 or small college level. I mean, athletics sport was stopped completely because of COVID. And so if that doesn't give some justification and rationalization to sport and how huge it is in our culture, I'm not quite sure what more we can do, because it seems I have had the experience, and I know Coach Forsty has as well, of justifying sport is more than just a hobby, and the positive impact that it brings for young men and women and the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is, and that there are so many job opportunities. I mean, I've experienced it recent enough that when I was blessed to take the job with Bethany, what do you mean you're teaching about sport? Well, what do you mean? What do I mean? I'm teaching about sport. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Coach, do you want to pipe in about that? You're on mute, Coach.
Isn't that the most used phrase this year? You're on mute. You're on mute. No, the financial and economic impact of what COVID has done, not even talking about the health of the students, but just the economic side, has professional sports and college sports scurrying to try to make up lost revenue that supplements not just their major sports, but also supplements every minor sport that you would have. Penn State or Ohio State's football program funds most of their other sports programs. And when they're not generating funds, then because of ticket sales, they have to try to find economically some other way to tap into that kind of stuff. Right on with it.
Thank you. And we're going to talk about those Power 5 colleges and that economic impact. So when we look at, as fellow colleagues, faculty members, and having a good understanding of how positive we can use sport in our curriculum and the impact that future prospective student athletes can bring to an institution. You know, there are studies that show, you're probably going to see my cat come in front of the computer, so I apologize already, but she wants to help. The impact of prospective student applications, you know, you see when you have athletic programs, and yes, it's not just athletic programs. The more successful an athletic program is, the more favorable the conditions will be, right? But you see applications rise in private institutions and public institutions, but more so in private. You see the quality of applications rise when you're offering athletic opportunities. The sheer number of applicants grows. You see ACT scores and the diversity of those ACT scores, you know, from both ends and anything in there between. The diversity allows a school to admit students who are not just maybe high end on paper, but are bringing more to the table based on their capabilities, and having that college degree where maybe they would not have been able to get a college degree because they didn't have that ticket, that medium through sport. Maybe they wouldn't have had that piece of paper that's going to open so many doors, right? And so we see that sport is a huge, huge positive impact for academics. We see, yes, there's stress level there, yes, but our athletes are learning how to manage their time better. There are studies that show that, and I have that all at the end with my works cited, higher cognitive functioning, the economics that Coach just talked about, you know, the money that college sports can bring into an institution. It's an awesome, massive positive for an institution. So that brings us to NC2A administration. What have they done in an effort to navigate the COVID crisis pandemic? So the primary concern, and the thing that they had issued out, I think it was like August 5th, the primary concern was with the health, mental, and physical health and safety of athletes. And so who's in charge? Well, the bare minimum, we have to align with those minimums set forth by federal, state, and local agencies. And I think, you know, sometimes spectators and maybe even athletes, as our athletes have become frustrated of, why do we have to stop? You know, why can't we have practice? Well, it's not just our institution, right? And it's not just our institution within the PAC or that's within NC2A, but we have to adhere to all these major guidelines that have been set forth by federal, state, and local agencies. That's the main governing body, right? And so it's been a real balancing, juggling act for our athletic administrators, and they've just done a beautiful job in terms of balancing that. One of the first pieces of information, and my screen here is blocking my words, I apologize. One of the first pieces of information that the NC posted was that re-socialization of collegiate sport, developing standards for practice and competition. And I put in italicized there, it was a guideline, very much a guideline, bare bones, because again, we have the NC2A, but within that NC2A, we have all of these other divisions, 1, 2, and 3. And then within those divisions are institutions. What are the institution guidelines? And how are those divisions broken up? I mean, look at Bethany. We can throw a stone and hit Ohio. We can throw a stone and hit Pennsylvania. So we're having to really dance a fine line. So the NC2A put forth these guidelines and then kind of left it up to, the divisions and how the divisions would move forward from there. And they set mandates of what they wanted with these set time deadlines. That was also a very big thing that the big part of NC2A put together was these time deadlines for each division to make sure that they adhere to. They also wanted to make sure that there was regular testing, that we're following masking, that we're taking care of social distancing. And okay, how are they going to separate our student athlete population from non-student athletes, and then from, you know, the local towns, the local town population, because the institutions and NC2A, we're looking at it in terms of what responsibility do we have to ensure that if we are moving forward with sport, that we're not putting anybody else in harm's way. And so it's been a very fine line and juggling act. And so then we look at those subsequent sport management and administration. And, you know, we're Bison, so I'm going to focus on our relationship with the NC2A and our Division III status, and in our membership of the PAC, the President Athletics Conference. So that just shows you, I mean, we have 3 entities right there that we're dealing with. We haven't even talked about Brooke County, West Virginia, and federal regulations. But what we needed to do is ensure that we're addressing, you know, logistics, any financial fallout, operational issues. And the NC2A also mandated that in the division level, when you're addressing those 3 main, you know, functions, that we are relying on scientific data, right? So we want to ensure that we are using credible and reliable sources. And so, you know, that comes down to our in-school athletic administrators, and, you know, what are they going to do with the schedules? And I mean, what I talk about in today's presentation is just briefly brushing the surface, because I mean, we're always thinking, you know, our curriculum, our content, our profession is the best, the most difficult to understand. But sport is truly incredibly very dynamic in how vast it is. So when you're looking at scheduling, we're not just talking about, you know, game schedules, but my goodness, with the social distancing issues, you know, our athletic administration, how are we making sure, just to use the practice facilities and, you know, the weight room, and making sure that each sport has the same amount of time, but within the social distancing parameters. Schedules is it's just a huge topic. But if you just look at seasons and games and play, and looking at regular season versus postseason, and because if you have so many, you know, we saw so many colleges, just look at the football season, and we concluded the professional season on Sunday with the Super Bowl. So if you just look at football season, how many times did we see games get moved because teams had too many cases, or there has been exposure, and therefore they had to quarantine? And so they had to have that balancing act of, are they going to play enough games to ensure that they qualify for postseason championships? And then you looked at those different conferences, and some that started later. I mean, it was just pure chaos, right? And so with the subsequent sport management administration, then that continues to trickle down. So we're not just talking about our athletic directors. Well, our coaches are sport managers as well, right? Because who directly speaks to our athletes? And one of the studies that was put out by the NC2A that we'll look at towards the end, who directly talks to the athletes are the coaches, and that's who they feel most comfortable with. So there was just like this huge, quick adjustment in terms of training the coaches what to say. Make sure you're enforcing these guidelines, make sure you're communicating these guidelines, because our athletes are looking to you. So what research measures did the NC2A take? I mean, right away, like the academic nerds that we are, they used their NCAA research and NCAA sports science, and they put together the NC2A student athlete COVID-19 well-being study, and got a lot of great feedback. Over 37,000 student athletes responded over all divisions, 1, 2, and 3. And the majority of those students reported a high rate of mental distress, you know, just being stressed out. Over a third had experienced sleep difficulties. More than a quarter of them were talking about having this sense of loss, and if you talk to any of, especially our senior athletes, right, who didn't get to finish their spring season and just not getting to close the yearbook, for lack of better phrases. Some 1 in 12 reported the inability to function. Some other reportings showed that this was something that I hadn't really thought about. And, we're looking at these young adults and we're calling them young adults. But how many of our students, and it's something I'm going to bring up with my students now thinking about it, their families come, they drop them off. Do they know how to get to the doctor? So 80% reported knowing how to access a medical provider. And then they looked at that and broke it down by gender. 60% of men versus 55% of men. Boy, there's a whole study in that, but that's a whole other soapbox. 4 and 5 of the athletes surveyed had talked about both the local regulations and how it impacted their access to the appropriate facilities for training. So it wasn't just, there was some recognition of, it wasn't just their institution, it was, local regulations, local and state, federal regulations. Those emotional barriers, how are our student athletes? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? And that fear of exposure, 43%, pretty high. Maybe it was higher than what I would have assumed, right? And we shouldn't assume. That lack of motivation, being linked to that level of distress and the feelings of stress and anxiety, and overall sadness and depression. So the study, the well-being study, was incredibly comprehensive. And with that, they were polled about, do you have a positive feeling about your academics? So it wasn't, the NC2A truly embodies that student athlete mentality of students first, athletes second, right? And so what are your feelings? Because your whole world has been changed, where you're normally used to balancing time and juggling all these schedules. Do you feel pretty confident about passing your courses? Overwhelmingly, 70% of the participants did. 51%, felt pretty positive about keeping up with their classes and their work. 90% of them, here's this huge point of communication. 90% of student athletes had reported, even though, practice is halted in their normal lives, how they interact, 90% of them were still in communication with their teammates and the positive feedback about that. 56% of them were talking about the fact that their coaches were communicating with them multiple times a week, and that was where that coaching staff, that's where they're getting all of the information. So there's so much for us to learn in athletic administration about what we need to do in athletic administration preparation programs. And at Bethany, we have this coach help me out here with the race track, recreation, athletic administration, and coaching education. And that we're teaching young men and women how to be coaches, how to be effective coaches, right? And so that tool of communication, we're seeing it come out in studies like the NC2A provides. Oops, let me go back. Sorry about that. One of the things that the study had found was the biggest thing that students were asking about, student athletes were curious about, concerned about was, okay, what are we going to find out? So we lost the spring. Are we going to return to play in the fall? So constantly looking for that future. So let's look now, we see what the NC2A did to have a better understanding of what was going on with our student athletes, and, mentally, physically, and emotionally. So let's look at the economic impact. And so institutions have to look at the costs that are incurred from those student athletes who are infected with COVID-19, and then therefore the exposure that can occur to, non-student athletes, to other institutions, student athletes. We see this, the study, it's on my last slide. I'll bring that point back, but this regressive model of business for college sports, and how, Coach had talked about when you have a school like an Ohio State or a Penn State, those big Power 5 schools, and they're losing tens of millions of dollars because essentially two sports are funding somewhere upwards of 20 programs, football and boys basketball. And if we are cutting the ability for ticket sales, for, gate revenue, concessions, everything that comes with holding these events, the amount of money that's lost is kind of unfathomable. And as a result, we're seeing universities already cutting those non-revenue earning sports, which is later going to be possibly be an issue with Title IX issues. And so what are universities looking at cutting? How are they justifying that cutting? Are they making any type of projections of bringing them back? Because the fallout has just started, right? And I put esports out there. I'm not a big esports fan, but that's a huge topic, right? And that's something that we have to look at in these sport preparation programs, sport studies preparation programs. And a lot of these studies are very much in the infancy age or stage, but they're very much being, ramped up to look at, okay, what was the interest in pre-COVID-19? What was that interest in being involved in esports? And when we lost the ability to play, when it's been minimized so much, what is that impact? So there's a lot of opportunity for future studies there, because what they found so far is that, having government intervention, that federal, state, local intervention, if we're including, if there's that type of intervention, that there could be a plan for inclusion from institutions, and institutions may really be pushed to do that in some type of a way to make up for lost revenue. I mean, we're going to have to really think outside of the box here. So those legal aspects, and I threw some out there that, I mean, this is by no means limited to, there's so many more topics that we could discuss, but insurance, the insurance of athletes, the insurance of facilities, your liability insurance, your travel insurance. How are insurance policies going to change after COVID-19? Once we get past this initial bubble, how are those insurance policies going to change? How are those premiums going to change? That's going to affect institutions, right? Okay, so Title IX, we know that, we often, and we talk about in our classes in our sports study program, that Title IX, and Coach can talk to you a great deal intimately about how it truly opened the doors for women in athletics, right? And it was a huge thing with gender, but Title IX is really an education law, and athletics falls under that, thankfully, right? But what we really haven't seen is what also might need to fall under that are income and people of high penny, people of lower incomes, and how is there discrimination issues there? Are there discrimination issues with race? And one of the things that athletes have been asking for quite some time is, why is my school making all this money and I can't make money off of my name? I can't make money off of memorabilia about me. Well, COVID-19 is really throwing that into light again, right? And Title IX could possibly cover that issue. If we're protecting gender, why aren't we protecting race and culture and income? Looking at program cuts, looking at the CARES Act and our civil rights being violated with suspension of programs and possibly suspension of funds that student athletes were getting as an opportunity to be a part of that institution. Legal aspects in terms of contracts that will be written, those post-19 or post-COVID-19 sponsorship contracts, employment contracts, advertising, venues, all of those contracts are going to look very different. Well, we're going to have an opportunity with education programs to start looking at that immediately. And I think that leads us, right into, it opens the doors for us, these possible areas of study and research. We're academics. We are nerds by default, right? We love to research. And so some of these, visual images down here are just things that I've put into my Canvas course of just like content that we offer, the areas of study that we could encourage our students to partake in for their senior project at Bethany. If you're looking at economics, are we paying athletes? Are we allowing them to profit from their name and their image? And then the studies that can come off of that. Looking at health studies, is it affecting, how is the effect of crowds or lack of crowds affecting our athletes, their mentality, is it affecting their grades positively or negatively? How about the long-term effects of those students, which these studies have already started, on students who were diagnosed with COVID-19 and the fallout of possible heart issues, which heart issues have kind of been on, a topic of concern for quite some time. But is COVID-19, is that affecting it? Sport interest, how has the fact that sports stopped, are we going to see a decrease in programs that are feeding colleges, our youth sport programs that are feeding our K-12 programs, that are feeding our college programs? Are we going to see a decline in numbers when those numbers were already declining? How is that going to affect our college sports? The institutions themselves, and you can look at it by division, Division 1, 2 versus 3, those Power 5 colleges. How about the revenue, the loss of the revenue, and what are the effects of that? I went through that pretty quickly, which I tend to do. So here we are, at the works cited page. A lot of great information out there. Looking at, ResearchGate, I got some neat stuff there. Looking at pillsburylaw.com, NC2A is just a wealth of information. But that kind of sums it up. If there's any questions or if you want to give input about, your thoughts or concerns, again, like I said, by no means do I think that I'm any type of aficionado. I think the opportunity, and that's a really weird saying it, right? The opportunity of the COVID-19 pandemic, of what, do we look at it as a total loss, a total wash, or should we be looking at it as an opportunity for education? And it's my opinion I've been using in my classes. Our students are, what a better time to gain research ideas and to run with their ideas. And we as educators, looking at, publishing and working with our students and talking about that continued education, there's just a lot of opportunity to gain more information about something that we hold so dear, if we're holding it dear enough to get a degree in it. So I'll zip it there. And if you have any thoughts or want to just interject, by all means, feel free.
Thank you so much, Chelsey. We really appreciate it. I might kick off the questioning with a quick question about something you raised kind of briefly, not that you necessarily have the answers, but something that I think we need to be thinking about, which is the insurance and insurability question for higher education. There's been an assumption that most of the discussion about long-term remuneration for potentially college athletes is of a positive sort. Like, I'm going to get paid for playing, or I'm going to get paid for the use of my image and my likeness on t-shirts and video games and such as that. But one thing that was lurking even before COVID with the controversy surrounding head injuries was the question of how much are the colleges and universities responsible for the long-term health issues that may arise from having participated in college athletics. And now COVID's kind of brought this to a head, because people are being given the opportunity, in some cases probably asked, to take the field, to go to the practice gym, the weight room during a pandemic, when we don't really know what the long-term consequences of those activities could be if they were to contract COVID. Do you see this sort of changing the conversation about where colleges, how colleges are able to get insurance, what colleges might be liable for in the long term in terms of possible issues? And if so, does that threaten the future of holding college athletics?
You're right. I don't have that answer, but I think that's definitely going to be on the table for discussion. And when I was looking at, doing research for this presentation and some symposiums and, opportunities for professional development that are being held by, things related specifically to law and topics that they're looking at, I think those are things that, institutions definitely want to be at the table to learn, because we've just starting to see the cost fall out. I think those costs are going to raise. That's my personal opinion. And we're holding these symposiums as early as June and July to educate our athletic administrators, and our top thinkers are telling us this, right? Because someone's always going to be looking to make the money. So how is that going to affect us? It's going to be huge. But again, then you have to weigh the pros and cons of, okay, if we're not willing to offer certain sport, then what quality of applicants are we going to be bringing in? So the marketability of the institution, does the cost out and risk outweigh, or are they outweighing each other? It's going to be tough for the decision makers to decide on. Absolutely.
Dr. Fletcher, I'll just chime in. Our kids, Sam, runs cross country and track at UMBC, so that's a D1 school. And it's been interesting, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier on, the importance of team relationships amongst the athletes. But then another aspect, and I'd be interested in hearing any perspective there, is for these athletes that have lost time due to COVID-19 and have to sort of reconfigure their collegiate careers for their eligibility, for their academic progress. And so that's been tricky, because, if you're not on a really large athletic scholarship, then that definitely can be a component in playing to figure out how to balance that.
So thank you. I like that interjection, because that was something that I wanted to touch upon. We experienced 2 baseball players, coach, who have decided to come back because they lost their spring. 2 that I know of, seven who are coming back because they didn't get to finish their academic and athletic careers the way they had hoped. So the decision that you have to weigh on, one of my former students who is now at Muskingum, he went the opposite way. He was thinking about prolonging, coming back a 5th year, and he decided that it was time for him to move forward and move on with his professional career. But what a huge decision to ask a young adult to make. But one of the things that the NCAA did come out with was that they would not suspend scholarships. You know, that student athletes would not lose their scholarships, but they have to make the decision. Okay, so I'm not losing my eligibility. I'm not using it. Am I going to now prolong my academic career? And you're right. I mean, at a D1, if you're playing for Ohio State, that's going to be a little bit different than if you're playing for Bethany College. It's, you know, what's the viability of making it to the league kind of thing? And is it time to pump the brakes on my athletic time and move on with my professional career? These are big decisions. So looking out, I think that there's going to be so many opportunities just to look at the emotional and mental state of our student athletes and how they've made these decisions and why they've made these decisions. Because if anything, it's going to help us as coaches, right? It's going to help us as athletic administrators. I just think that there's an awesome opportunity for us to learn from our student athletes in light of this pandemic.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
Well, several of our baseball kids that came back by extending their academic career by 2 semesters or 1 semester, whatever they choose, have picked up minors. Some of our sport management kids have picked up minors in management out of the business office and some things like that. And, you know, I've added to their academic undertakings. So it may be expensive for them to do that, but it's a choice that they made, which can help them academically also. Here's a really out of right field thought about all this. The European models, from an international standpoint on sports, doesn't run their college sports through institutions of higher education. They run most of their sports programs through clubs within cities and towns. Do you see the possibility that with the change in the COVID, and let's face it, most of our minor sports, are going to be the ones that are slashed, and the kids are going to still want to participate, maybe a resurgence of clubs during the school year to satisfy the competitive nature of some of those minor sports? Like a tennis club here at Bethany would be students primarily, but they could go then play a club at Wheeling or cross country or some of those other minor sports. I have a real fear for the minor sports, to be honest with you. I think we're going to lose a lot of great kids and athletes because it's going to be harder to fund those things. I just thought outside the box.
Another
Brian.
question?
I was going to say I teach high school, and I was going to ask your thoughts about how the high school athletes, losing their high school sports respectively, but wanting to play college, how they should address that, and how the colleges are trying to address recruiting when they don't have as much data as they would like to have on the kids' sports at the high school level.
Thank you. Great question. So, I wasn't working directly with K-12 students last year, but I was working with fellow athletic administrators, and the feedback. So when I explain that, I just don't want you to think that I'm getting that directly from the athletes themselves, but the feedback that I'm getting from, fellow athletic administrators was, they're still trying to circumvent that, and they're still trying to navigate that. But the fallout for the athletes themselves, emotionally, was just massive, absolutely massive. And, again, it's that abrupt ending, just that abrupt ending, and where do we go from here? I do know that some students, baseball is a big sport from where I worked at in athletic administration. They went to JUCOs, junior colleges, in an effort to try and get those stats up, those stats that they were already kind of like on the cusp. So as an opportunity, as a possible opportunity to get to a 4-year school, if they were wanting to get to a D2 or a D1. So that was a route that many of them went. There's certainly ways to work around it, but it definitely pumps the brakes on what their plans were, right? Brian, I'm going to mess up your last name.
Avolio.
Avolio. You put your camera on. Were you wanting to ask a question or make a statement?
Yeah. Well, I've been listening. It's been great. I'm trying to teach online in North Carolina as well. Great to be here. Proud to be a Bison.
Nice.
The thing that really caught me was at the end when you were talking. I'm coaching football, and we're a spring football program. I'm athletic director at the middle school. So when you were talking about what I like to call the pipeline, the pipeline, yeah. Coach Forsty got me straight back in the day. The community pipeline, it's like we were talking the other day. Right now, we're a high school football program with 19 kids on varsity, no JVs.
Wow.
Started first official day was yesterday. And, we were joking that we have trash cans out there that are outnumbering our players because we can't go full scrimmage or, we're doing half line. But, with the community programs being shut down, the middle school currently is not face-to-face yet. So, they're not doing that. That's one of the things that scares me feeding the next level, whether it's D1, D2, D3, whatever, JUCO. That's the piece that, gets me. And what Coach Forsty was talking about, the club model, one of the cool things that we've talked about in our district in North Carolina is because of travel and getting kids and expenses on buses, the implementation of possibly doing intramurals at school so we can at least try to keep that, be ahead of the curve and keeping kids involved in those sports. So the intramurals are becoming a huge thing that's the plan to do it. But I would be interested to hear, what can we do to try to save those pipelines? And we're labeled a majority minority school district. So we fight a lot of the issues in our community, but I'd be really excited to hear what your suggestions are to help the pipeline.
Well, great interjection. Thank you. Awesome that you're coming on from North Carolina. That's pretty cool. Where I worked, it was this constant battle, battle of, I hate to use the phrase, but of egos, of, community sports. Do we go for that big trophy in the community sport, or do we really try to work towards feeding the K-12 atmosphere who's ultimately going to feed, it was constantly this push and pull. And so I found my biggest success was when I just got people to just sit down and communicate. And it took time, it took effort, and in some regards it was quite successful. Others, not so much, but more of a meeting of the minds and looking at it like we've got to see this big picture, right? We're all hurting. We all want our children out of the house, off the couches, being healthy, being active. We see, there's just numerous studies of the positivity that being active in sport brings us, right? So it's just we're going to have to collaborate. We're going to have the mentality of being true teammates and practicing what we preach. It's really going to take a huge movement of marketing, of, pounding the pavement. Our high school coaches and our middle school coaches are going to have to get out in the community. Some typically don't like to do that, right? They want to be on the field. They want to be coaching the sport. Well, you're not going to be able to coach the sport if you don't have the athletes there. So it's, I ran into both extremes. Coaches who, if they show up, I'll coach them. I'm not going to go recruit. I'm not going to go ask children to be a part of it. But we may need to, or we're going to lose it.
Even outside of athletics, it's good to keep in front of us that, there's just going to be a lot that's very different about kids coming out of the K-12 stream into college next couple of years that we are not used to. I mean, these are students who not only had their athletic careers greatly interrupted and maybe difficulties substantiating that they're the type of basketball player that they think they might be and could play at the college level in that regard, but also, academically speaking, they've had a year of class online. They've had, extended periods of time they weren't in school. Maybe don't have the opportunity to even take a standardized testing. It's going to be a very different thing because of that interruption. And a challenge to figure out where those students are and what they need to make up.
I think that's the big part of all of this in reference to COVID-19 and athletics. We just don't know. And I think Chelsey did a nice job of referring to, research. We've got to find out what's going on. Yes, academically, the kids are going to be suffering, but from a sports standpoint, it's going to change our lives. Things are going to be different. We say we're returning to normal, but I'm not so sure the normal is what we're returning to. Not just from a health standpoint, we don't know what effect this COVID has on people's bodies, but just from a mental attitude of we got so comfortable. And this is one of my coaching phrases I used all the time. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Well, that's what we have right now. We have an uncomfortable time that we're trying to become comfortable in to do what we normally would do. And I think it's going to be interesting that we study it going forward, that we're going to learn a lot.
Absolutely. Thanks, Coach. Much appreciated.
Any other questions at this point? No, not seeing any. We really want to thank you, Chelsey, for a really great talk and for doing this for us. We're very grateful, and also to encourage people to tune in in 2 weeks for another COVID talk with Dr. Walker, and I guess it's a month from today for Dr. Brosh. We hope to have some others coming out later in March as well. So please kind of keep this on your radar, and we'll be sending out announcements, and we appreciate you joining us. All the COVID talks are available through the college YouTube channel and the Facebook page, just recordings. So if you want to go back and watch any ones you might have missed, please do so. And thank you so much. Have a good snowy Tuesday, at least in Bethany.
Dr. Lane, thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, you're very welcome, Chelsey. Thank you so much. I hope everybody has a really great day. Give her claps.
Should I end it or wait for people to